All right, we are live for the Duran live chat number 12. How is everyone doing? Can everyone hear me okay? If you can hear me, let me know on the chat. I have with me Peter Lavelle, host of RT's Crosstalk, and Mark Sleboda, international affairs and security analyst. Both of these gentlemen are in Moscow. Guys, would you like to say a quick hello? Peter, Mark.
Great to be here. It's turning into a great tradition on at least my evening, Sunday evening.
How you doing, ladies and gentlemen? This is Snixa, our third short bait.
All right, everyone can hear us. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this live chat. We are also waiting for, yes, where's Alex? This sucks. No, Alexander is trying to log on as we speak. So welcome once again to the live chat, guys. Visit the Duran shop, pick up a t-shirt, donate to our PayPal and Patreon page. And send us your super chats. We will answer your super chats. And we'll try to answer all your questions as best we can. Peter, Mark, let's get moving as we wait for Alexander. Let's kick it off. We have some questions that people sent in before we did the program. And the first one is from Fidorino. And Mark, why don't you take this one? They would like to know, are there S-300s in Ukraine?
Oh, my, yes. S-300 has several dozen S-300 units. They are a little bit older model than Russia currently occupies. They haven't seen some of the latest upgrades. But that, of course, was one of the big questions of the beginning of the Ukrainian conflict right after the putsch that overthrew the government there, and when MH17 was shot down. Because it was shot down by a Buk system. And the Ukrainian government also has dozens of Buks that were in the area of Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region, within a range of MH17 when it went down. So Ukraine has both S-300s and Buk systems and several other air defense systems, all of, of course, Soviet Russian manufacturer.
All right, staying on the Malaysia air crash, Tweety Bird would like to have both of your opinions on what you think of the Malaysian air crashes. I guess all of them that have happened over the last years. If you guys would like to chime in on that, real quick.
Well, I mean, as far as MH17, we still don't have the complete story. It's amazing how the media just kind of let it disappear. Accusations were made, and accusation equals guilt, and they weren't interested in the forensic element of it. I remember when one of the reports came out, Western-oriented, they didn't even allow, it was a press conference releasing it, and they didn't even allow questions. They don't even want to be asked about their own report. Simultaneously, the Russian manufacturer of the boots, they explained what kind of system shot down the airliner, where it was made, all of these things, all these forensic things here. Western media took no interest in it whatsoever. Ukraine was a potential culprit in all this, and they were made part of the investigation. I mean, it makes no sense at all. Actually, Malaysia, late in the game, was allowed to be part of the investigation. In the beginning, they weren't even a part of it. So as far as the disappearing plane, well, it disappeared. I mean, so I really don't know what to think about that. I think if you go to, you ask, there was an American politician, she ran for president, I think, at one time. She said God took the plane or went into a black hole.
I think since just in the last few weeks, they've actually found some wreckage. Was it MH 370? The Buk,
the one that disappeared. It was the one that disappeared.
Yeah, I think they found some crash wreckage of it in a jungle in Asia, and that seems almost undoubtedly, from what we've heard at least, that was due to some type of psychological crisis of the pilot. That it may have been intentional on the part of the pilot. Yeah, in Ukraine, it was what we know for clear from all the evidence is there was a surface-to-air missile fired at the passenger airplane over the conflict zone, the civil war going on in East Ukraine, not far in Donbass, not far from the Russian border. Although there may have also have been some Ukrainian fighters in the air at the time that might have been involved in the incident, it does not appear that they were involved in shooting it down, at least as far as we know. But I would be, lying to tell you if I knew exactly what happened there. There are competing stories on both sides, and as far as I'm concerned, they both have some holes in them.
Peter, just to wrap up on this question, BJ would like to know, why did the U.S. not share satellite data? That's actually a question that I've always had too.
Ukraine.
When I had my famous face-off with Chris Cuomo on CNN, that was my first one. And of course, being acting and thinking like a 13-year-old girl, he didn't give me an answer. All he did was repeat what the State Department had to say. So yeah, Mark and I have talked about this before, and I think it gets into what's the term, Mark? Sources and methods. I mean,
yeah,
there was so much that the U.S. and the Russian side was going.
The Russian side did not reveal either satellite or radar side as well. And according to the Ukrainian, the Putsch regime in Kiev, both of their radar, their main and their backup, were down at the time of the incident. So that tells me that, first of all, that the whole situation was far more complicated than anyone is willing to admit. Someone in the Russian, Ukrainian, and U.S. governments knows exactly what happened, but it's quite clear that we're not getting the full picture from any of the three sides.
All right, and we have the one and only Alexander Mercouris, who has joined us from London. Welcome, Alexander.
Hello, guys. I had some problems with connections, and now my two dogs became overexcited. I was flapping around. So anyway, they're here.
Welcome, Alexander. And Peter, we also have a question from Virginia before we started this live chat sent in. Two questions, actually. And the first one is RT under the thumb of the Kremlin? And the second question that Virginia posed was, Gorbachev said Putin is pulling back democracy in Russia. Is that true? So, Peter.
Okay, well, the first one is, let's start from the basics. RT is funded by the Russian government. I know that government-owned assets, they do talk to each other, but I'm just the talk show host. So I take my time is taken up by producing my own programs. I don't get a daily briefing from the powers that be about what I should say and what I should do. I've been made like 1,300 crosstalks, and I've never had any outside editorial influence or pressure. So I can't answer the question definitively because I don't represent RT. I just represent myself. Mark was on my program today, as he often is, our Bullhorns format, and he knows that I talk to the guests before and say, hey guys, these are my ideas, what are your ideas? And then they send in their ideas, and then we put them together, and then we do the program. So I'm not saying that's how RT works, but that's how I work, and I don't really I'm not really involved in other aspects of RT programming. I used to be before in the early days, but I'm just really tending my own garden, as it were. As far as Gorbachev, I think Gorbachev had those kind of remarks years and years ago. There's been a lot of, in the early time, the first two terms of Putin's presidency, there was a lot of political reforms here, how people are elected, how governors are selected, and a lot of election laws pertaining to the Duma, their parliament here. But Gorbachev is the one that gave away his own party and country, and for a lot of people in Russia, and I think I can talk about the majority, what Mikhail Gorbachev thinks nobody really cares much about. Okay, seriously, he's still very much a creature of the West, and I'm not trying to denigrate the guy. He signed arms control agreements. He did some stuff. Okay, good stuff. But history is not going to be as kind to him in Russia as the PR image of Gorbachev is in the West.
Peter, can I ask you? Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Obviously, Peter is only saying this as he did, because Putin is standing right off camera with a gun pointed at Peter's head. I've been in Peter's apartment before and see Putin with a gun pointed at Peter's head personally. You can take my word for it. If you want to know how RT really works, go to YouTube, type in RT exposed in leaked video. Watch how evil Kremlin propaganda bullhorn really works. You can see it all there on YouTube for yourself.
All right. Before we go to a question for Alexander, Peter, I have one quick question, and this one's probably for me, but maybe the viewers will also take an interest. How do other shows, from your experience, how do other shows deal with guests? Do the producers give them a question before time? Do they qualify them? And how is that different from the way you work with your guests?
Yeah, it's called pre-interviewing, and what I do, and everybody I'm talking to now in this podcast has been on my program, and so you all know how it works, and it doesn't deviate. It's always been the same procedure. What I do is I determine the topic of the program. I write up 5 questions, and I ask my producers to distribute it to potential guests. Why do I do that? Because I don't want everyone saying the same thing. So here's a pro, here's a con, here's a neutral, here's an independent, and then because that creates the debate. But no one is qualified to come onto the program. And no one, once the answers are read, oh no, we don't want him because he'll say that. No, we never do that. We never do that. And why? Because it just takes one tweet to destroy my reputation. Saying, oh, they do pre-interviews, they're screening, they're censoring. We don't do that. We don't do that at all. Believe me, I've had some really, really hard recordings with people very rude to me, very emotive and all of that, and I have to deal with it. And but there's no pre-interviewing in the sense that MSNBC, CNN, and I would presume even maybe Fox, but BBC for sure, okay, and Sky TV for sure, because I've been on there. So they want to filter what you have to say. I just want to know what your position is. I'm not interested in filtering.
All right, Alexander. A question before we started the show on Afghanistan and the peace process that Russia is trying to moderate, trying to broker. What are your thoughts?
Well, can I say, I don't know how far this negotiation is going to go, if it is even a negotiation. The Russians are saying it is not a negotiation. But if anybody can broker a peace in Afghanistan, and if it's the Russians, well, I think that's a good thing. Afghanistan has had 17 years of war since 2001. It previously had long periods of conflict going all the way back to the 1980s, where, let me be absolutely clear, this is a what I'm going to say is, in my opinion, historical truth. There was a change of government in Afghanistan in 1978. The United States didn't like it, and it assisted an insurgency against the government there, with all the crises that we've seen since following. And as I say, if the Russians are in a position to get the Taliban and the Afghan government together and reach a compromise, so much the better. Now, can I just say a few more things? The Taliban has always been very careful to separate the Russians from the US and from the US coalition. I remember reading way back in 2000, that, and this was from Sergei Ivanov, a very senior Russian official who was a member of the National Security Council of Russia. He said that back in 2001, even at that time, the Taliban was trying to extend a reach to the Russians to try to get some kind of a compromise or some kind of negotiation underway. So the Taliban has a different attitude to the Russians to what it does to other people. Taliban should not be conflated with Al-Qaeda. They are different organizations. The Taliban may be an Islamic Wahhabi fundamentalist movement, but it has been overwhelmingly focused on Afghanistan. So it is not an international terrorist organization in the way that Al-Qaeda is. And thirdly, if one wants to broker a situation in Afghanistan which would prevent Al-Qaeda from replanting itself there, I think that option is open. I think that the Taliban was prepared to do that back in 2001. the United States invaded instead. I think the Taliban was moving towards handing Osama bin Laden over then. I think that they would not want to see Al-Qaeda back. I think that the Russians have a far more realistic understanding of what is going on in Afghanistan than the US does. And I think if the US tries to obstruct this negotiation, which I am sure it will do, then I think that would be an entirely bad thing. And I'm sure that there are also geopolitical imperatives that dictate the US position. Perhaps others might want to chip in on that. But overall, that's my view.
If I could just give my personal experience, a few years ago, I was in Afghanistan when Karzai was still president, and I interviewed him along with other members of the Russian media. And I remember being taken around town, and we had very good security, very good. And we were bulletproof vests and everything, helmets, the whole thing. Kind of weird. And I remember our head of security. We were going through the town, and I always thought, wow, this. I felt like I was in a Hollywood film. And he turned to me and he said, "Don't worry, they're not really interested in us. Okay, they actually like Russians." And the interesting thing is, the only buildings that have any kind of stature, they're all Soviet made, all of them. As a matter of fact, the presidential palace used to be the main office of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. I mean, it was very much there. And I remember, our driver, I got into his minivan, and there was somebody speaking in Russian. And, I was always looking around. And at one point I was trying to figure out who is speaking. And it was the driver, and he had all this garb on. He was an Afghan. And then later he told me, he said, "Oh yeah, I studied in St. Petersburg, and Russian women are awesome." I mean, he spoke fluent Russian, and he was very much at ease. And so just to kind of put a little personal touch on what Alexander Mercouris is saying is that they actually, considering what happened with the Soviet experience there, they actually do look to the Russians as being a fair broker, and the Russians are doing their damn best. Of course, the U.S. will do everything it can to obstruct, even though they really want to get out.
All right, Mark, we have a question for you from Borchdi the Mighty. What's your reaction to the recent frigate collision after the NATO operation in the region?
Incompetence.
You've been on maneuvers before, right?
I have been on maneuvers before, and the ship that I was on, the USS South Carolina at the time, has been known at times to back into a pier. So accidents happen. Of course, the optics of it are really terrible. I honestly don't place that much importance on it, right? The U.S. Navy has had a series of accidents, particularly in the Pacific, over the last few years, and there's been a lot of attention drawn to, shall we say, some of the less competent individuals who are, in captaincy, throughout the fleet. But the U.S. does by far have the largest naval fleet in the world, and although there have been an increasing number of accidents, recently, that said, they do manage to do the majority of their operations without such clumsy incidents. But of course, it really does not do themselves any favor, in the press, the Norwegian press or whoever bothered to report on it. Not too many people, as far as I know. I enjoy a good smirk out of it, and I'm glad I wasn't on that ship. But don't attach too much importance to it.
All right, let's get to some super chats, guys. Alexander, we have a super chat from Z Mohammed. Will Ukraine and Russia restore their ties?
I think in the long term, yes, but I think it will take a lot of time. Situation in Ukraine is very bad. There is huge amount of orchestrated hostility towards Russia in Ukraine. The political situation is not good. So I'm looking at long term, and I'm afraid we're talking about a fairly long term. And I'm not sure how it will happen either. Mark will no doubt have his own view about this.
Mark, your own view.
Yeah. I mean, I of course, my wife is Crimean, and we have family in East Ukraine, and the situation is not good. And, you know, the end of the day, Ukrainians are still killing Ukrainians. Yeah. And before there's any type of reconciliation of, you know, Ukraine with Russia, the Ukrainians need to solve their own situation. Of course, that's very hard when NATO and Russia are tacitly backing the East and, you know, the West of the country against each other right now. And, you know, this was the awful result of an EU association agreement that refused any compromise with Ukraine's existing free trade arrangements with Russia and the Commonwealth of Independent States. And, you know, they forced a Ukraine, which is divided largely geographically east-west, between a Ukraine that looks nominally west and hates Russia in the west, Ukraine, you know, particularly what formerly used to be known as Galicia and used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and an eastern Ukraine, which has a large numbers of ethnic Russians, is by far, you know, majority Russian speaking. Actually, the entirety of Ukraine is majority Russian speaking, and views Russians as ethnic brothers, right? You know, as the same people, more or less. And it is an identity conflict in Ukraine that anyone who is paying any attention to Ukraine could see coming. And you know, in this case, both the West and I also fault the Russian government for not stopping what was happening when I think it could have. You know, this identity question blew up into civil war with, you know, support on from West, you know, on one side and Russia on the other, and it's a terrible, nasty little situation. And we were just talking about it today. There is no figure in Ukrainian politics now that has over 20% support throughout the country. How they're going into elections, right? Next year. How do you have elections in a country where no politician has over 20% support and the sitting president has less than 10% support? It's a divided, messy, corrupt country, and I do not see an end in the situation. Unfortunately, the Donbass right now is in a frozen conflict. And the Russian government's plan B to the failure of the Minsk agreement cunning plans is to wait until the elections in Ukraine next year and hope things get better. And when there's every probability that things could get worse.
All right.
Yeah, can I just also add, it's not a very violent place. I mean, if we don't have people who are standing out and opposing the policies in Ukraine, it's because people get killed in Ukraine. We must never forget that.
All right, we have all the world leaders are in Paris right now, and Macron gave a pretty interesting speech, and we have a super chat from Beatrix Focas for $20. Peter, how would Macron's European army benefit Putin and Russia?
Well, that's a good question, and it's could be the best answer will be very, very long. I think at this point it's just kind of more of a PR spin right now. You know, go to the National Interest website and type in NATO, and you'll find some fascinating articles how the United States has tried to obstruct and smother, use that word in your search, smother Europe's attempts to create a defense architecture for itself. The U.S. has blocked it every single way. There's not entirely clear that and then we're basically talking about the European Union. The European Union is really interested in that. It's not obvious. Well, I guess it is obviously clear that governments of the EU don't want to spend a lot of money on NATO. Why would they want to spend it on a European army? So I think it was just Macron, you know, acting like the Sun King. Everyone's coming to Paris, you know, for the commemoration of the end of the First World War. I find it really quite disappointing, and I wonder if anybody in the presidential palace in Paris kind of saw the oddity of talking about the expansion of a European army when you're trying to commemorate the breaking out of peace 100 years ago, ending the First World War. So, you know, Macron this really doesn't. he's not a person of gravitas to take very seriously. I think that if we see, instead of having world leaders going to Paris, I think it would be more interesting to see European leaders come together at a forum of their own and start seriously talking about this, if this is what they want to do. I'm not particularly sure they do want to do that. And I think that, and I've differed with Mark and Dima, and we had Glenn Deason on today on Crosstalk, just to what degree the Europeans really think Russia is as a threat. Now, if you want to have an army, then you have to have a threat, and I guess Russia's the best candidate. Okay, Mark, I know you want to chime in.
No, Macron is just, you're right. He's not a figure that you can take seriously. This is one of Trump's big gripes, and it has to be said, been the gripes of the United States for a long time. Trump is just the one to actually voice it publicly, that you can't get European countries to spend 2% of their GDPs on their own national armies, right? On their own national armies, in line with NATO strictures, right? NATO doesn't require them to spend an extra 2%, just 2% on their own national.
It's because they do that. That's not because they don't. I'm sure they don't want to, but they know that the U.S. will fill the gap anyway, because that's what they've done, president after president after president. So yeah, I mean,
France is one of those countries that is not. There's only 5 countries in Europe that, up until this year, have spent even 2% of their GDPs on their military, despite all they talk about a Russian threat. And France is not one of them.
And they know that even if the Europeans don't step up and pay more, the Americans will refuse to let NATO flounder. No, I mean, that's very important to them for a wide variety of reasons, okay? So, I mean, the Europeans actually are in a position to play chicken with Trump, okay? Trump can complain all he wants, and they still are not going to do it. And we'll continue having the situation we have now, maybe worse because of these exercises we had in the Arctic and all that. And we have Poles and people in the Baltic republics egging on NATO. But it's going to take something a lot more than little Mr. Macron to move this situation one way or another.
All right, Peter, I want
no EU army for at least 10 years. And in 10 years, there may not be an EU in the form that we know it today.
Good point.
Right. Peter, I want to stay with you, and then I want to get Alexander's viewpoint, and we're going to move on after I get your answer to this question. We're going to move on to Antifa and Tucker Carlson. A lot of people are talking about it on the chat. And this question kind of segues into it a little bit, actually as best you can, from Macron to Tucker Carlson. And it comes from North Idaho Exposed. What are your thoughts on what Macron said during his speech when he mentioned patriotism versus nationalism? And of course, he may have been, I don't want to say for sure, he may have been referencing Trump's speech that he gave at a rally where he mentioned nationalism. Peter, and then Alexander, and then we'll get into Tucker Carlson and Antifa.
Well, the left just has their favorite dog whistles, but the left is one big dog whistle. When Trump said, that this is what makes Trump an oddity, very interesting. When he said that he was an American nationalist, I'm a historian, okay, by trade. I didn't for a second think he's a white supremacist, because every national leader in a way is a nationalist. The word is not in vogue anymore, and when it's invoked, it usually means something. It's like alt-right. I mean, before 2016, the alt-right meant people that weren't part of the mainstream, and now that term has been appropriated by the left. Okay, it means what they say it means. So, there's so many little ways that Macron was poking Trump before and during the trip to Paris. I mean, go to RT. There's a funny video of him, grabbing him by the knee and all that, and Trump is like on it's like a cold date. Something's really wrong. He doesn't show any expression and all that. And Macron's he's trying to punch above his weight, okay? And he looked really foolish, okay? Okay, let's segue a little bit here to Tucker Carlson. I mean, I have to wonder if this is some tipping point here, because the mob that terrorized his wife, and you and I did a separate video on it, which I think was one of our best ones, to be honest with you, because I'm very passionate about this. But You know, these people are the real totalitarians. These are the people that are ideologically possessed. They cannot think beyond, because what their ideological possession comes from a sense of their greater morality, not through their arguments. They have no arguments. All they do is have memorized talking points, okay, that don't make really any sense if you want to deconstruct it. But you're not going to have a chance to deconstruct it, because they're going to come to your house with baseball bats and they're going to say, I'm going to send you a mail bomb, and we know where you sleep, we know where your children live. That is the negotiation tactic of the left today, okay? It's disgusting, okay? So Trump's usage of that term, it opens up a whole can of worms. I perfectly understand it, but I don't think he meant it in the way they did. Look at MSNBC. I mean, their dog whistle went up. It's a dog bullhorn, okay? And that's what's so pathetic, how the mainstream media has poisoned public discourse.
Alexander, what's your take on Macron's speech where he referenced the nationalism phrase? And then we've talked a little bit about this, Alexander, before we do our videos, and you have a lot to say as well on Tucker Carlson and Tifa.
Yeah. Well, first of all, can I discuss Macron, because to say something which I think is important to stress, in France, the party, the movement that identifies with patriotism ever since the French Revolution has been the left. It is the left in France which traditionally stands for the nation and for the patrie, the fatherland. Now, what Macron is doing, and it's important to stress that he is this not real left, that France used to have. He is a kind of strange, amorphous central figure. He is trying, in effect, to subsume all the various states of Europe into this European federalist project, one which many people on the traditional French left generally oppose. And this attempt that he is making to somehow set the nation against, patriotism, nationalism against patriotism, shows, one, an extraordinary lack of understanding of French history and of French society. It isn't going to play well in France at all, but it also shows the very technocratic and elitist agenda which Macron is following, and the way he is trying to position himself and France, or at least the France which he leads, as being at the center of this European project. So can I just say, it's not going to succeed, it's not going to play well in France, it's not realistic, and the whole tide of history in the European Union at the moment is running strongly against it. As Mark said just a few minutes ago, it's questionable whether we're going to have a European Union as we know it in existence in 10 years. Now, as for Tucker Carlson, this is an American issue. I'm absolutely horrified by it. I find the idea of people turning up and smashing property and attacking people in their houses, and Tucker Carlson's wife having to hide in part of the house of this thing, and with apparently little sign of the police or the security forces taking immediate and dramatic action, as they should be doing, to take control of this situation. I find this extremely concerning, and it seems to me that it points to not just a growing intolerance in the United States, which is what Peter has talked about, but a growing breakdown of public order in the United States as well. And that is something which everybody, whatever their political views, should be extremely concerned about. And can I just say, violence against property is violence. These are not revolutionaries. There's no revolution that they're trying to promote. Tucker Carlson is not somebody to be targeted in this way. What happened was straightforward criminal activity, and that is how it should be defined. And these political slogans that are being used to justify it, the fact that they're being used in this way should concern many people.
Yeah, if I could chime in there. First of all, briefly on Macron, I'm speaking from the political axis of someone who is strongly against both nationalism and globalism, global cosmopolitan liberalism, globalism, whatever you want to call it. my favorite quote from Macron that to me continues to sum him up in a nutshell. And yes, he is a literal Rothschild bankster, right? He is not a figure from the left. He is a neoliberal centrist imperialist, right? Macron said during his campaign, which he was somehow still elected, there is no such thing as French culture. This is the guy who would become the French president. There is no such thing as French culture. There is culture in France, and it's diverse. Now, you can enjoy culture that comes from non-French, citizens of France, not being ethnically French, not having the history. But I'm just trying to imagine the reaction if the Russian president said there's no such thing as Russian culture, or even in the United States, you couldn't say that.
Well, Louis Mensch did, remember?
This is insane. I mean, Victor Hugo and Charles de Gaulle want their culture back, because I think they would definitely disagree with Macron. As for Tucker Carlson, I mean, this is amazing. I remember Tucker Carlson when he was this little, sorry, Peter, bow-tied neoliberal on Crossfire, and I found him one of the most.
I would call him a neoliberal. He was a conservative.
Yeah. Okay, he was one of the most repulsive figures in the world, as I remember. On Crossfire, which was in many ways the inspiration for Crosstalk. That said, he's undergone a huge political evolution, as we all have. Peter and I have, and everyone has. I think we all go through political evolutions. And today, I find him one of the only national figures actually conducting a realist dialogue with the country that people both right and somewhat more from the leftish, statist position that I come from can speak to. And this Antifa, these anti-fascist fascists, right? These violent anarchists, I think that they are just as much a threat, just as much or more a threat to the country than the relatively, much smaller numbers of organized white supremacists. And what they did with Tucker Carlson is, by definition, an act of political terrorism. An attempt to shut up Tucker and other people. You may not agree with everything. I don't agree with everything that Tucker says. I certainly agreed with him on Syria until he was shut up by his own network, but that's another story. But that was an attempt to intimidate him into stopping what he's saying politically, and I find that absolutely repulsive.
Peter, there's a lot of people talking about Antifa, and I'm glad that Mark brought it up. What is your take? A lot of people are asking who funds Antifa, why are they allowed to operate? What exactly is Antifa? Everyone has their opinion. What's your take on Antifa? Who are they? Why do they operate? Who's behind them?
It essentially comes from the universities, okay? I left university, obviously, a long time ago, 25 years ago. Well, no, 20 years ago. And I read all of these people. I mean, what's really interesting is that when people say that's postmodernism, that's post-Marxism, but I actually know what that is because I actually studied it, okay? I read all of the great works. I've said, and this will maybe surprise some people, but some of the thinkers of the Frankfurt School I find really quite interesting. The problem is that a lot of their work was descriptive, but it wasn't supposed to be a user's manual. And this is what has happened here. It's been weaponized. And so they've taken the typical, stereo, this very simple Marxist paradigm of the capitalist class oppressing the workers. Okay, so what they've done is they've emptied the bottle of that, but they've kept the form, and now they say no, it's your cultural oppression, your gender oppression. So the working class now is all of these mishmash of groups here, and this is the formula. So the workers are virtuous because they're oppressed. Okay, so minorities are virtuous because they're oppressed. And the more oppressed you are, the more virtuous you are. Like I said earlier, a couple of minutes ago, these are all memorized one-liners, okay? And it's very simple. These young people, they're programmed as activists, and it's taken over all of the social sciences, almost all of them, okay? Now it's moving into the hard sciences, into like engineering and physics and things like this. the left, these Tifa people, they're intensely anti-science. They don't believe in science because we can actualize science. So science is a white man's construct. It's nonsense. It really is nonsense. But what has happened is the left has embraced this as a tool to essentially say, we can represent you, but all these groups are put into their little boxes, and that way you can control them, okay? And for example, this ideology forces women to be married to the state, okay? So the state is the father, okay? There was a time in the 1960s when the Great Society, Johnson's Great Society, wipe out poverty and everything, which is a good idea. The way they tried to do it was disastrous. They would literally go into homes and say, how many children do you have? I have 2 children. Oh, is there a man in the house? Yes. Well, no, we can't help you. But then everyone learned, oh, well, if there's no man around, okay, great. We'll give you help, which created actually generational poverty, and mostly for minorities. Black people have benefited least benefited from all of this, okay, because they're on the political plantation of the left. Now, you've seen a number of people over the last few months are breaking away from that, and of course the left condemns any black people that want to leave the Democrats' plantation, which of course the Democrats are the ones that supported Jim Crow. Okay, the ironies here are abound. It's so many of them, but it's a political strategy to capture different groups. To give you just a very simple example, the Obama coalition. That's why Hillary tried to do it. Try to use this identity politics, and it failed because identity politics if you push it too hard, then the people you're oppressing will say, well, what about my identity? And then that's how you get white working class people saying, well, no one speaks for me. We've been abandoned completely by the Democratic Party. The Republicans finally woke up and started embracing it. But that's the middle class, not white people. It is not a dog whistle that separates races. But of course, Antifa will say that because, well, if they say it and you disagree, well, then you're a bigot, you're a racist, you're all the other things here. So, it really comes from the university. I know because I was there watching it germinate and then actually bloom. And it is all over academia right now. There are very, very few conservatives in the social sciences in America. I would probably even wager in the UK as well. They just simply don't exist. Think of Jordan Peterson. He's a lonely man in academia with his views.
Very well put. And on that, everyone is jumping on the chat. Everyone has their opinion. Guys, keep things civil.
I'm glad I can't see it.
We love hearing from you guys, and please send us your super chats. Also, go to the Duran shop, buy a t-shirt. It really helps out a lot. And you can donate to our PayPal and Patreon pages. The links are in the description down below.
Send a super chat so I can make you angry, okay?
And guys, someone had a question earlier when we were talking about RT, and they asked who funds the Duran. No one funds the Duran. We work as a team.
You're looking at it.
And you're looking at it. So we really appreciate
The Duran doesn't fund the Duran.
We appreciate everything that you guys do to help us. And Alexander, the midterm elections are over in the United States, but now we have a bunch of your colleagues, lawyers, who are descending on Florida, and they're going through a series of recounts. What's your take on the Florida recount situation, Alexander, and what's going on in this breaking story, which could change the Senate composition?
Well, it won't, I think, radically change the position on the Senate. This is my understanding of it. I think, once again, what we see is that the electoral system in the United States, in many, many parts of it, is very broken and very dysfunctional. And this allows all sorts of people with all kinds of agendas to try to manipulate it to their advantage. And as I said, bringing lawyers in to decide elections and getting courts involved in elections in this way is extremely unhealthy and very bad, and politicizes the legal process and the court system in entirely the wrong way. And you can already see the damage that that's already been doing to the US. Now, can I also add to all of this that, of course, if there have been problems in Florida, one group of people were clearly not involved with those problems, and that group of people is the Russians. So we hear all the time about the Russians, and we've been hearing for 2 years about the Russians and how they manipulate the electoral system in the US. No evidence of that at all. Lots of evidence of problems with the electoral systems in the US. It's high time people in the US got round to sorting out these problems properly, so we don't have these crises at election time, and stop looking for outsiders to blame like the Russians. Now, that's my quick take on this. Again, I expect we're going to see more.
We're going to all find out that Al Gore is going to win the presidency. Okay.
Mark, me, Peter, and Alexander have talked at great length on a lot of videos about the Russian meddling. What's your take now that you see what's happening in Florida? And no one is mentioning Russian meddling now in these elections. But what's your take? Not yet. That's true. What's your take on all this, Mark?
Yeah. See, actually, that was my meddling. I, as an American living in Russia, and I am single responsible for forcing everyone to vote for both Trump and Clinton in the United States. That's how much influence I, as a Russian, have over my former U.S. colleagues. Now, it's a joke. It's so obvious. I mean, we've seen this show in Florida before, haven't we? Mm-hmm. The real problem with the United States is a broken political system, right? With two alternating corporate-backed centrist parties of power that either one or the other control the election supervisors, the whole in each state, according to who's won the last governor's race there, and regularly sue to keep third parties off of the 50 different state lists that you have to compete in a national election. It's absurd. It's an absurdly archaic, broken system that legally considers money as free speech. That is the most bizarre conception of democracy, that the rest of the world just sit back and you want to export this to the rest of the world? We call that corruption here. It's a joke. I'm sorry. I speak as someone who served in the U.S. military and once was an organizer for the U.S. Democratic Party, via Democrats abroad in Russia. I worked with the U.S. Embassy to help Americans to vote here, and I've completely divorced myself.
That's how Mark and I met each other. That's how we met.
That's how we met each other. So I find the whole thing, absurd, broken, and it would be laughable if it wasn't so very tragic.
But one of the things is here too, and to kind of echo what Mark was saying, is that you see these election boards and these election supervisors in these congressional districts. They're intensely politicized, and this again is eroding confidence in the system here. I mean, what's her name, Snipes? Sneaky Snipes, they're calling her right now. I mean, this is a person that has a record as long as their arm of being completely incompetent. I mean, even local TV reporters are interviewing her, and she can't even answer a simple question at all. And when she's challenged with this guy, walk away. I'll check on that. Okay. I mean, it's more incompetence. The system is archaic as well. I mean, for foreign viewers, every county more or less determines how people are going to vote. There's no standard. Okay, maybe there are paper ballots, maybe machine ballots, different kinds of machines. When they count the votes, how they count the votes. It really is kind of a mystery in a way. But in the last couple of years, 2016 to 2018, I have to say the biggest irregularities are really at the foot of the Democrats. Okay. Elections are called. People can see. I said the last 2 years, Mark. Okay, because I didn't say 2000 because it worked for the Republicans. Okay, so but it is a system that really needs a serious revamping. Okay, I don't understand why they have abandoned. Well, I know why they did. They should stay with paper ballots. You have evidence. You have forensic evidence. There's a guy, Tim Canova, that has been on my program, I think, once or twice. He was running against Wasserman Schultz. And when he ran against her 2 years ago, he wanted to contest the election. And the same woman, the Snipes woman, destroyed all of the ballots, which you're supposed to keep for 16 months or something like that.
Excellent point. Excellent point. Yes, exactly.
I mean, I'm not invoking a conspiracy here, but I mean, certainly someone has an incompetent past and being called out by the legal authorities, by a judge, and she's still there. I mean, it's certainly incompetence. It may be more, but certainly incompetence.
And Canova is a progressive left candidate as well.
He's a good guy.
And he felt he got cheated.
Despite all of the meddling that the U.S. has done for decades now in Russian politics, Russia does not need and cannot interfere in U.S. politics with some Facebook memes and RT's reporting that Wall Street is shock greedy. I mean, it's absurd. Not to mention, there is no room for Russia to meddle in U.S. politics with all the meddling that was going on by Israel, by the United Kingdom, the tail wagging the dog, by Saudi Arabia, by Ukraine backing Clinton in the Democratic Party in this last election. Those were real meddling.
All right, Alexander, we have a question from Michael Julian, and he would like to know, I'll summarize his question a little bit. If the real question of our times is, will globalist neoliberalism, imperialism be confirmed by Trump as the enemy? So in other words, will Trump tackle what many people call globalism, neoliberalism, imperialism? Maybe you may want to call it the swamp as well. What's your thoughts, Alexander?
This is a huge thing, and of course, it is expecting too much of one man to do that. Even if Donald Trump is able to, coherently challenge this thing. I think we are seeing across the Western world a growing challenge towards globalization, which and all the ideologies that go with it: neoliberalism, imperialism, American hegemonism, American exceptionalism. They're all bound up together. I think there is a growing reaction to it. There's a growing reaction to it in Europe. There is a growing reaction to it in the United States. Donald Trump is partly a catalyst of that reaction, and partly he is a consequence of that reaction. He is both. He is not, I think, a person who single-handedly can turn the tide back. That has to be turned back by people voting in places all over the West. That has to happen with countries like Russia, like China, like India, like places in the Middle East, resisting the attempts of the imperial powers, the imperialistic powers, if you like, the hegemonic powers, the United States especially, to influence and to run their affairs. That has to take the form of people in workplaces, resisting demands from multinational corporations. We should not look to one individual to do this thing. And of course, one of the great problems that we lack at the moment is a consistent and articulated philosophy or intellectual challenge to this thing, because since the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, an intellectual challenge has not really been put together. There have been attempts to do it in Russia, there have been attempts to do it in France, there's some attempts to do it in the United States, but we don't yet have an intellectual response. And I think that is probably the single thing that is most missing at the moment and which is needed most, and Donald Trump is not the person at all who's going to provide it.
Well, the thing is that Trump doesn't want to get rid of capitalism, doesn't want to get rid of liberalism, he doesn't want to get rid of any of these things. He wants to get rid of globalism, that it's a competition. I mean, he wants everything the way it is. It's fine, okay? But he wants America. He wants his own country to be dominant and not to be applied to these globalistic rules. So, and that's why, he will say even the EU is our competitor, okay? So, I mean, I think whoever asked the question here, I mean, it's not getting rid of anything, it's harnessing these things to his advantage and what he thinks is the American national interest. See, this is what makes him such a disruptor on the global stage, because the U.S. and trade is his favorite thing. I mean, the global trade framework that we have right now was invented and enforced by the United States. And let China in and they'll become Jeffersonian Democrats, which was stupid, okay? Always when you expect to bring people in or invade them, and you're going to change them in your own image, it always fails. So, Trump isn't getting rid of any of these things here. He's showing a new way of understanding globalism, and meaning harnessing it to his advantage. And will he succeed? I don't know.
Yeah,
all right, let's get to some.
Let's just specify some terms here. Neoliberalism is an economic term that talks about an extreme interpretation of the economic side of classical liberal theory, most fully articulated by Friedrich Hayek, Hayekian, right? Trump is a neoliberal. Now, it is true that neoliberal politics, as enshrined in Bretton Woods and the World Trade Organization and, at U.S. economics in general, is driving much of what we call globalization today. If anything, Trump is a neoliberal a neoliberal nationalist. He, as Peter said, I think he wants to harness neoliberalism just to put the U.S. on an unshakable position at the top, right? But Trump is draining the swamp to fill it with his own creatures, who are neoliberal politicians themselves, just of a different variety and often favoring different corporations. That's all.
All right, let's get to some more super chats. We don't have a question, but Ramel says that the Duran is the best geopolitical news and analysis sources we have today. The panel is always so dense and great insights. Thank you, and keep up the good work. Thank you for that super chat and those nice comments. Ramel, Peter, we have a question. Ukraine on Fire by Oliver Stone is a great recent documentary. What are your thoughts real quick on that?
I think it is great. And it's one of a kind. There's nothing else out there, at least in the English language. I think there's some French or Italian filmmakers tried to make something, but it still has the Oliver Stone-esque touch to it here. I think you could be extremely academic and go through line by line, but I mean, the tone and the tenor of it, I think, is really spot on. And I thought it was great of him to give Yanukovych at least some space and time to explain himself. Okay, I mean, Dmitry Babich put it to me really, really well once. He says, hours and hours before the illegal coup in February 2014, Yanukovych was Merkel's friend, Joe Biden's friend. The European diplomats would give, what was it? Victoria Nuland said, wanted Joe Biden to call up and give him a attaboy telephone call. I mean, everybody was talking with Yanukovych. The hours after the coup, he was persona non grata. He was just a Russian agent, and he was a dictator and all. I mean, the narrative changed in a matter of hours. Okay. And at least in Oliver Stone's documentary, Yanukovych got to give his say. I'm not a big fan of Yanukovych, but for very different reasons, and probably people using the norm, general narrative about what happened in Ukraine, which is completely wrong with the Western narrative. It doesn't make any kind of sense at all. I remember, Mark, it was like a year or more so, the New York Times came up with their revisionist history of the events in Ukraine. I thought it was extraordinary. We discussed it at great length. I remember Mark sent me on Facebook like 26 points, and he was typing on his phone what was wrong with that article. It was brutal. It was an amazing article of propaganda. Mark distilled it down. I think he was on the Metro. I mean, it was just, he was furious about it, okay? That's what happens here. I mean, you can actually do a complete revision of something and open about it, and just say, well, never mind what we wrote before. It didn't matter. Okay, this is our new and improved version. Okay, it was extraordinary. That's what's happening with journalism now. The future is unknown, but the past is unstable. That was a joke in the Soviet Union, by the way.
Yeah, Oliver Stone's film is great. Everyone, by all means, watch Ukraine on Fire. I will one up you though. If you really want to understand what's happening in Ukraine, read a book. Read Richard Sakwa's. Richard Sakwa, he's a professor at the University of the UK. The book is Frontline Ukraine, Crisis in the Borderlands. It is on Amazon. If you don't want to buy the book, then there's still a great review of it you can read for free on The Guardian, right? The Guardian newspaper. Simply type in Frontline Ukraine, Crisis in the Borderlands, review Guardian. I'm sure you'll find it on Google. He's a friend of ours. He really understands what has happened in the Ukraine. And I think he really largely has an objective view from it that doesn't favor both sides. He just takes a realist description of what is actually going on. And that you would really understand what's happening in the Ukraine. If you read that, you would even get a good understanding if you just read the review of that book, as I said.
All right, Alexander, we have a super chat from Roscoe. Your opinion on Brexit situation and Theresa May.
Oh my
God,
Alexander! Oh my goodness! I'm getting. It's so difficult to keep up with this story. But suffice to say that as of this moment in time, literally today, there's more talk of rebellions against Theresa May. She's trying to put some kind of proposal together. It's been rejected by all the various members of her cabinet. Supposedly 10 of them have now told her that it's unacceptable. The Irish, Northern Irish Party that supports and props up her government say it's unacceptable. And yet, this dreadful saga just goes on and on and on. Now I'm going to make another prediction. I made lots and lots of them over this.
We're going to make a compilation.
Of them.
Make a separate playlist. Alexander Mercouris' predictions.
I think we are probably now starting to move towards an early election in Britain, not a second referendum, which I don't think either the leaderships of the two major parties want. But I think that the situation is now becoming so bad that I think that it's going to be a great struggle for Theresa May, whose Conservative Party doesn't have a majority in the House of Commons, to keep going for very much longer. And I think we're going to see a situation where there will be some kind of lost vote or vote of confidence. And at that point, we will probably see an election in Britain. I don't, unfortunately, see Theresa May being removed through an internal coup in the Conservative Party. I did think that a few weeks ago. I think the time for that has passed. Once we have a general election, if we see a new government with a new prime minister, by which I mean a Labour government with Jeremy Corbyn, then perhaps we will have to see some kind of attempt by Corbyn to try to bring a solution to this mess. His ideas are not clear at all. And his party is every bit as divided as the Conservative Party is. So, if we're looking for Brexit clarity, we have to be realistic. We may not get it. But the question was not just about Brexit, but about Theresa May. I think we will see a general election perhaps within the next 2 or 3 months.
All right. To everyone, to Peter, Mark, and Alexander, what is the future of BRICS?
Well, can I start with that one? I think that there is a great deal of mythology about BRICS. I think BRICS is basically Russia and China. That is the real core alliance. I think there's some other countries that have been tacked on, like Brazil and India and South Africa, which are there basically to provide padding to conceal the fact that we're talking about a Russian-Chinese alliance at the core of this thing. I think India is not happy with the fact that Russia and China have been growing together increasingly. In fact, I've seen reports that the Indians want the West to ease off on Russia so that they can draw it away from China, a hopeless idea. And of course, with Bolsonaro's election in Brazil, Bolsonaro gives every impression of being strongly pro-American. So I think we could very well see BRICS, the B part of the BRICS, gradually peeling off. But the real core of this thing, which is the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership, grand strategic partnership, whatever euphemism they like to give it, alliance is the word I prefer. That remains and will continue. That's my view.
I went to a big media confab last year in Beijing for under the umbrella of BRICS, and in talking to the other letters, let's put it that way, the delegation. Yeah. Every single one of them has a different vision of what BRICS is, okay? And I remember representing Russia during our televised panel and afterwards. I mean, they were throwing slings and arrows at me because Russia wasn't doing enough. And I shot right back at them because they were all communists, okay? I mean, it was a weird conversation. But I just said, look, we're all in this organization for one reason, because we want to protect our sovereignty. And Russia is not going to give up its sovereignty for you guys, okay? No way, okay? And what you want to do, these BRICS people, you know, outside of Russia and China, they want to duplicate the G7. Yeah. And I said, and who runs the G7, okay? So who's going to run BRICS, all right? You want it to be the Chinese? Do you want it to be the Russians? No, I don't think so, because every single one of you are very protective of your sovereignty. So, you know, particularly the South African delegation, I mean, I felt I was, you know, talking to, you know, women carrying Mao's little red book. I mean, I was just like, whoa, I don't want anything to do with that, okay? And that's why, you know, BRICS is an idea that is very fluid, okay? Because as we found out in Brazil, if the government changes, then the organization is less effective. Then the organization itself is not effective, okay? So I've never put a whole lot into it. It's a nice, warm, fuzzy idea. That's okay, all right? I mean, when I was there, I said, look, we should pool our resources and have an alternative to Google, okay? You know, we should have a major alternative to search and stuff like that. And I said to my Brazilian colleague, I said, you know, I learned about your country vis-a-vis Bloomberg and Reuters. We don't have ours. All global information is still dispersed from Western capitals, from Western media organizations. The countries that were around the table, none of them have that kind of central ability to be able to distribute news, okay? I mean, even at RT, they quote, you know, Bloomberg and Reuters. You see my point?
Yeah, BRICS is dead. All right, we all know BRICS was started as an acronym, actually, by Goldman Sachs, trying to sell
for markets
an investment package in what they called developing economies at the time. You know, this was already more than 2 decades ago. But when they actually got together and sat down, and they discovered, hey, we actually have something in common. And it's not really economics. I mean, other than Russia and China have synergistic economies, and China has invested heavily in Brazil in order to get commodities. But other than that, we're pretty widely dispersed around the world. But about 8 years ago, 6 to 8 years ago, they actually did have something in common. As a voting bloc at the UN, particularly at the UN Security Council, in defense of the UN Charter founding principles of sovereignty and non-interference as an anti-Western regime change, at least politically, right? Politically at the UN organization. That is the way they were 6 to 8 years ago. But with the election of Modi in India, it was a huge disappointment to me the way Modi has turned out. He's drawn India much closer to the United States. South Africa has become focused on their own internal politics, and Brazil has just completely fallen off the boat. First with Tremor, in a legislative coup seizing power, and now with the election of Bolsonaro, who is an openly, he supports American imperialism over his own country. And that BRICS is dead, right? And I don't see any way in the near future for it to be revived. What is left of BRICS, I think Alex started. Yes, it's Russia and China. And even when we're talking Russia and China, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I'm very worried with the inclusion of Pakistan and India, their own separate geopolitics and their problems with each other, that will make the Shanghai Cooperation Organization also an ineffective organization that becomes a little bit more than a talking shop. At the core of it is a Sino-Russian alliance, and BRICS briefly was a great idea, but it's now dead.
But if that's it, then what do you need the other countries for, really?
No,
I'm sorry.
You don't. I should say I completely agree with Mark about bringing in Pakistan and India. I think that was a mistake. And the Chinese wanted Pakistan brought in, the Russians wanted India brought in. It will weaken the totality of it. It was a mistake to do it. The Shanghai Cooperation Agreement was far more effective as a Eurasian group than bringing in the various states of the Indian subcontinent. Exactly.
All right, we're approaching 800 viewers. We are well into our second hour. Guys, send us your super chats. Also donate to our PayPal and Patreon. The links are in the description down below. And there's another question for all three of you. It's also a very broad question. What do you guys think about when people say World War III is coming, especially with all the military buildup, the exercises, the NATO exercises in Europe, and all this stuff that you're always hearing on a lot of articles, World War III, World War III. What is your take on this subject?
Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I mean, we are at multiple flashpoints in the world today where World War III, through a chain of events and misunderstandings, much like what started World War I, and also in a multipolar period, right? Whose memorial we are, celebrating or remembering today. And the three biggest flashpoints right now, again, are Eastern Ukraine, Syria, still, and the South China Sea. And every one of those is because of the U.S. from far removed from each of those three places in the world, attempting to exert influence, and either change local governments or contain China in its own backyard, as it will, on the other side of the Pacific. Any one of those three situations where the U.S. is exerting military force, could very well lead to a World War III situation. No one wants a World War III situation, right? The U.S. doesn't want it. Russia doesn't want it. China doesn't want it. No one wants it, but everyone still wants to protect what they call their national, often really geopolitical interests. Unfortunately, the United States defines its national interests as the entirety of the world and asserts that no one else has any legitimate national security interests. And that's a big problem. No one wants World War III, but we're all looking at rapid advances in technologies, hypersonic weapons, hypersonic glide vehicles,
cyber war.
weapons in space, cyber warfare, sapient, AI, or, sentient AI, God forbid, killing machines that all of the major countries are developing right now. These things should all scare everyone. And the possibilities for biogenetic warfare, I've discussed that on the Duran before. Everyone should be scared of where technology takes us. Technology took us in World War II, to the development of the nuclear bomb, Oppenheimer, and mutually assured destruction. That was what saved the day at the time. Now we're dealing with a much more complicated world with multiple great powers, right? A multipolar world with multiple countries and multiple interests all having these weapons. The dominant fight in the world today. I mean, there still are ideological differences, but that's not the dominant fight today. The dominant fight today is in some ways a clash of civilizations, yes, but I would, and there's some truth in that, and some falsehood. But even more, just take a look at it. It's geopolitics. It's national interests, exerted on a global scale by the most powerful countries in the world. Culture and civilizations of course do have something to say in all that as well. I don't. And no one thinks World War III is right around the corner because no one wants it. But these types of military conflicts could happen through misunderstandings, miscommunications, failures to accept other countries' national security, red lines in their own backyards, and things could very quickly spiral out of control.
I think that I would just add on to that is that the United States, its military and its intelligence community acutely understand that the unipolar moment, it's already over. That they haven't come to terms with that, and I think that's why you see these flashpoints, because we have people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. I mean, these are unilateralists. They want to settle some of these issues, if not all of them, as soon as possible on American terms, because as every day passes, their ability to be able to control political outcomes lessens. And this is what is the anxiety of these people. They're really, really anxious about this. They're very worried. And that is why it's very confrontational. I mean, John Bolton was in Moscow what was like a week and a half ago. He didn't come to negotiate. He came with a middle finger, okay, dictating terms and conditions. But those days are coming rapidly to an end. And this is what is making the world very unstable. Mark is absolutely right, because countries like Russia and China and Iran fiercely prize their independence and their sovereignty. And the unilateralists in Washington, the neocons, they say what is ours, what is yours is negotiable. And this is why people are talking about it. I did an entire program on this 2 weeks ago now. And it was very popular because I read quotes from very, very important people in China, in Russia, in the United States, in Turkey, talking about public figures talking about the possibility of war. Yes, it is a possibility. You wouldn't know that if you were watching CNN and MSNBC and Fox in equal measure. But the unipolar moment is coming to an end, and this is creating panic. And that's why tensions can easily ratchet up. Look, this is the month of Iran, okay? Trump's policies on Iran and its export of oil is kicked in. Then this could backfire terribly for the neocons in Washington, because they will realize they cannot get their way anymore, or what they're willing to put in to get their outcome may be too high of a cost, because it could lead to war.
Not everywhere. Not everywhere.
Not everywhere. No.
Alexander, your take, and then you may want to also segue into Iran as well, because that's also a very hot news story.
It certainly is. Let's start. I think on balance, we're going to avoid a World War III. In fact, I'm perhaps reasonably sure we will avoid a World War III, because I think the various militaries of the great powers understand that a superpower war would be annihilating. And I don't think anybody wants to go down that road. I say anybody, but I must make an important qualification. Mark brought up the history of the start of the First World War. The single thing that's caused this First World War to happen is that one great power, which was Germany, believed itself to be militarily more powerful than the others, but at the same time also sensed that its power was slipping and that its internal political situation was becoming less stable. And that caused some people in Germany to make a very calculated decision, which is that they would go for broke, start a world war, and they even preferred, in some ways, to see the whole thing go down to disaster, go down in flames, rather than face a situation where Germany lost its position in Europe. Now, when I read people like Max Boot in the United States and some of the other, when I read people like that, I do sometimes wonder whether these people also might not be prepared to go for broke and risk a world war, rather than find themselves in a situation where they cannot do what John Bolton did in Moscow, which was, as Peter said, come along and read lectures to the Russians and indeed the world. And it is that kind of pathology, in some ways, that is the most frightening. Sometimes political leaderships do make decisions which are suicidal because they will not face the alternatives. Japan in World War II is another excellent example. Now,
you brought up August 1914, and you're absolutely right. But I think also you really spot on describing Germany. But let's look at the other great powers. Russia went to war for the status quo. It didn't want to lose what it already had, and
correct.
We had the situation in the Balkans where they saw their power receding within the Austro-Hungarians making a power play in the region. My point is, if you look at all the calculations and the reasoning of all of the great powers at the time, it gets down to something very simple. It's not really sexy when it comes to geopolitics, I suppose, but it was about prestige. And you have to remember the Russians had the revolution in 1905, a political instability. They lost the war against Japan. Again, Alexander Mercouris is right. I mean, the status quo was very, very fragile. I think we're in a very similar environment today because the United States sees its prestige, its ability to affect political outcomes to be on less than solid ground. I mean, even 15 years ago, it was different. And this is what they're grappling with. All these countries, particularly China, China's rapid development onto the world stage. It's just I think it should be more assertive, considering its economic power, its muscle, and we're getting there. I mean, look at some of the things that are coming out of China right now about preparing for war and all of their exercises. This again brings up the issue of prestige, where the Communist Party has put a lot at risk here, lots at stake, because when you go to China, you don't think much about the outside world. They are very, very insular, okay? And they are the Middle Kingdom, and China is not rising. China is returning to its natural state in the world, and that's before Western colonialism carved up China. So I think we really can't underestimate the really importance of how the great powers, and actually we're saying great powers now. That's only been recently. Because all through Western history, we've always talked about the great powers. Then the Cold War, we never used that terminology. Now it's back, and the same geopolitical rules are coming back. The Americans don't understand it and don't like it. The Europeans don't either, because they're postmodernists. They don't think in terms of sovereignty. They don't think in terms of borders. But Russia does, China does, Iran does. They fervently believe in borders, and this is one of these misunderstandings that is only increasing on the world stage.
Let me add some context to what the other two earlier said, because World War I was about this one event, yes, but it was also a change from a world order system dominated by European global empires through modernity into something else, right? And it was this crisis of the old world. You'll hear a lot of rhetoric, on this anniversary, about democracies versus authoritarianism. Nonsense. The British Empire and the French Empire at the time were giant, world-spanning, repressive empires. The Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman were relic continental empires that were falling behind in the modernization race. And Germany at the time, and Italy, to some extent, and Austria, did not have big global continental empires, and they were very resentful of that fact, but they were developing through industrialization into a new type of power on their own. And then, as Alex said, they went for broke. But don't believe the rhetoric at the time that there was any good guys or bad guys.
Absolutely.
It was a world of empires transitioning into a new era, helped by collapse of old political systems and new technology. And that has eerie parallels for what we're facing today, with the collapse of the post-Cold War unipolar moment, the dawn of a multipolar world, the return of wealth to these other great powers, right? The U.S. still being at least temporarily first among equals, and all of these new technologies, these very dangerous technologies breaking out that change the rules of mutually assured destruction in the Cold War. It's a very dangerous time, and there's a lot of very good parallels, not complete analogies that are accurate, but you really have to look and learn some lessons from World War I to the situation today.
Absolutely.
Alexander, I want you to continue on this topic, but I would also like you to get into Iran. And Thomas Adams would like to know why no one talks about Libya anymore and what happened to Libya.
Well, let's first of all.
Yeah, so we have a lot of just take it away, Alexander.
Because
I think they don't talk about Libya because they're too embarrassed to. It has been such a total
Alexander,
story.
hang on. Let me tell you something. Yeah. It was about a year ago, and I wanted to do a program on Libya. And during the course of all those events with Libya, we did so many programs. So my producers got the list of people. It's all going to be fine. We're helping these people. This is Gaddafi's soldiers are on Viagra and they're going on massive break. Remember all these really crazy
absolutely.
And so they contacted them. Nobody wanted to come on to defend. No one wanted to come on. Okay?
The one thing that they did achieve, and we've got to say this, is, Gaddafi was a personality. He did have a country behind him. And to the extent that that was seen as some kind of a challenge, it was destroyed. But what has followed has been so awful in every way that, as I said, nobody wants to talk about it. David Cameron doesn't want to talk about it. Nicolas Sarkozy doesn't want to talk about it. It's no longer discussed on the page.
Obama blamed everyone else.
Exactly. The Times doesn't talk about it. So that's why we should talk about it, because Libya is a terrible example of what this awful policy of regime change, of exceptionalism, of a messianism, neoliberal messianism. We've seen what Mark was talking about, these people in the United Nations who are trying to change the whole structure of international law and to twist it into allowing the Western powers to intervene in other countries. We should talk about it, because that is the consequence of it. Libya is the consequence of it, what we see in Libya now. And let us be very clear, it was a crime. It is an international law crime. It was an act of straightforward aggression against a country which was threatening no other country. It was a straightforward case of aggression made in violation of decisions of violation of the UN Charter, by twisting the language of UN Security Council resolutions to mean something completely different from what they said. We should talk about it, but we should not be surprised that some of the people, the authors of this catastrophe, don't. Now, can I turn to Iran? Iran is a major flashpoint, and I have just done recently a program with Alex Christoforou, which you can find on our channel, in which I have said that I think that these sanctions that the US is imposing on Iran are going to be quite effective in achieving what they set out to do, which is to choke off Iran's oil exports. I think people are putting too much in the fact that the US has temporarily granted certain waivers to certain countries, to certain major customers of Iran. I think they did that for purely pragmatic reasons because they don't want to see the oil market crash. I think they expect and hope, the United States, that is to say, expects and hopes that as the oil market stabilizes, they will gradually be able to pull back on those waivers. And I'm afraid what we have seen, and it should not be a surprise to anybody who's followed international affairs over the last few years, is that all the talk of defiance that was coming out of Europe, that they were going to set up an alternative payment mechanism, that they were going to encourage their companies to go on trading with Iran, and all that, that has proved a total and complete broken reed. There is no prospect of that happening. All European companies are pulling out of Iran. So Iran is going to find for itself facing an economic siege. It's going to find itself having to resist sustained attempts at political destabilization. We're going to see the whole regime change bag of tricks turned on Iran with a vengeance. I think Iran's political institutions are strong enough to survive it. That is my own personal view. I think that some of the Eurasian powers, specifically Russia, principally Russia, will try to help Iran through this mess, through this crisis, not because they are an ally of Iran, but because they do not want to see further destabilization in Central Asia. They do not want to see a gigantic Libya, in other words, in that part of the world. So they will help Iran to the extent that they can. I think that Iran will pull through. I think the Iranian people are going to suffer severely. And I think the great danger is that if 2 or 3 years down the line, it becomes clear to the people in the United States and in Israel and in Saudi Arabia that these sanctions are not achieving the political objective of changing the regime in Iran, because that is the objective. I think these people, some of them, may decide to double down, and we might start seeing more forceful, even violent, even military steps being increasingly taken against Iran. I'm not definitely saying that's going to happen, but that is for me the fear. So that is my analysis of the situation in Iran, a very, very dangerous one.
Well, what I would say is that I think Iran, because it has dealt with sanctions for so many years from the United States, I agree with Alexander Mercouris. I don't put much stock in the Europeans. No. Don't underestimate Iran's ability to get its oil to market, okay? There's a lot of people that would love to take up the slack, that will be maybe less than transparent. They know how to stay under the radar from the U.S. Treasury. Yes. I don't think this is going to work. I think it's going to be a spectacular failure. I'm not convinced that other countries will have their waivers withdrawn. I think right now this is more of a political statement. It's rhetoric. I mean, again, Donald Trump pulling out that back of an envelope, checking, okay? The U.S. military does not want to go to war with Iran because the law of unintended consequences. Iran has a lot of asymmetrical ways to react, and it would be very, very ugly. It would be devastating. Again, we've used the word sovereignty here, guys. They're going to protect it. There's every reason that they will. And one thing is for sure, ever since the Islamic Revolution, what is most important to the current political leadership in Iran is the survival of that revolution. And they will go to war to protect it. look, it was 8 long years with the war with Iraq. You know, almost no one in the West knows that, okay? They will fight tooth and nail. And what they've done is all of the so-called moderates are gone, okay? Because dealing with the West never works, because they never keep their, even you sign an agreement and they won't keep their word. You don't underestimate how the political dynamics in Iran are evolving as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about the war is an extremely good one. We mentioned it on our program, Alex and I think BC, you're basically right. I think, as I said, I think the political system in Iran is strong enough, and the country is strong enough. Iran is by no means a country without resources, and I don't just mean oil. I mean, it's got
want to trifle with Persians.
Exactly.
Okay?
I mean, but it's got quite a lot of industries. It's got a fairly developed economy. More so.
Look at it. Because of the sanctions, Iran essentially overlooked. Actually, I read this in the Economist, of all places, is that it really is self-sustaining because they've had so much import substitution over the years. Okay?
Exactly.
I mean, it's like parts for planes. The American planes, you know, old ones. I mean, they need those things. Okay, they need those things. But I mean, it's obviously a lot of Iranians would like to have more Western consumer goods because it isn't a poor country. I don't think it's economically managed very well at times. Okay, but it is a very rich country, and it's no Iraq, and it's no Afghanistan. Don't make that mistake.
That's exactly the point I wanted to make. So I think the Iranians will withstand this. I have to say, Peter, I'm less sanguine about the sanctions than you are, but we'll just have to wait and see.
We'll have to see.
First of all, in Libya, you have to consider that the catastrophe that has happened was a perfectly acceptable plan B for the West. They would have liked to get a liberal government in control that would do whatever they want, but you know, preventing a country that was trying its best, not always successfully, but to unite Africa, along a political line that was not definitely in line with U.S. geopolitical goals for Africa, where right now you are very much seeing a conflict of influence playing out between the United States and China. You know, Gaddafi was just a complication trying to unite Africa, African states that the U.S. didn't need. And if they couldn't get a pliant little liberal-ruled client state supplying oil to Europe out of Libya, then a destroyed country, it was a perfectly acceptable plan B for them.
Yeah, I agree.
Iran, Iran has weathered, sanctions by the U.S. and the EU, for over a decade now. They will weather this. Will it hurt? Sure. But, China and Russia in particular are developing ways to get around U.S. sanctions. And they will continue those and only increase them. And this time, the Europeans, at least the countries aren't providing political support to the United States and all of this.
Good point.
But while the U.S. military, and again, as a U.S. veteran, may not want to go to war with Iran, meaning do not expect to see 500,000 U.S. troops, invading Iranian shores anytime soon. But the neocons very much do want conflict with Iran. They want sanctions to weaken the political system. They want to do everything they can to, stir up another green revolution, right? Create political dissent in the country. They'll fund groups like the Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK, and the Baluchi independence movements in order to create ethnic instability, which there is also the potential for in Iran. And they would very much be amenable to airstrikes in support of such a mission. Think combined U.S., Saudi, Israeli, British airstrikes in Iran, creating a Libya-type scenario, trying to destabilize and overthrow the government in the country. That is entirely possible. And I really think
it's happening now.
Yeah, the neocons are working towards that goal.
All right, Peter, we have a question for you from Afro Priapis. He wants to know, Peter, in Turkey, we are brainwashed by tales about how Central Asian countries, Siberian Russian oblasts east of the Yangtze River, as well as Western Chinese Uyghurs, like the Turks. Do they like the Turks?
I wouldn't say I'm an authority in this area here. I think the Turks would like to think that they like the Turks. I think they would believe that. No, I think some of the groups that you were mentioning, I mean, of course, they could be used as political pawns, okay? I mean, the Uyghurs, for example, I mean, you know, one
Islamic Party.
Yeah, exactly, okay? I mean, some of these groups can be used for Turkey's geopolitical advantage, but I mean, I think that kind of goes back to mythology and things like that. I mean, I don't see really any real strong affinities today. And the groups that you mentioned, they have their own ideological initiatives and ideas that I don't think necessarily fall under the rubric of new Ottomanism. So it's a nice story, but I don't think there's a lot of bones on those flesh. Mark, you may know more about it than I do.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I mean, the Central Asians may not have anything, against Turkey per se, right? But it doesn't mean that they feel any great cultural affiliation for them either. Central Asian countries are, the governments there are primarily concerned about the continuation in power of their own elites. That is their primary motivation. Through that, there is a great deal of cultural, because of linguistics and the history of the Soviet Union. They don't have a bad memory of the Soviet Union in Central Asia. They have a very good memory of the Soviet Union. They were the last countries in the Soviet Union.
And they're the ones that wanted to stay in the Soviet Union.
When Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine dissolved it unilaterally, Kazakhstan and the others were left with, are you guys turning off the lights? I mean, do we have to go now? Right? They benefited enormously from the Soviet Union. And the Central Asian elites still speak Russian. That is the language of academia and governance and so on. And the other big influence on Central Asia today is Chinese capital, Chinese money investing, right? Because they want that as a transportation route and for natural resources, which are abundant. And both of those two vectors are managed and utilized very effectively, at least previously, through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which leaves Russia and China not competing, but cooperating for influence in Central Asia. And that just doesn't leave a lot of room for the Turks or the Americans.
Well put.
Alexander, let's get into what they say may be sanctions against Saudi Arabia. There are reports that Saudi jets are not being refueled by the U.S. military. Are we looking at possible Trump sanctions against Saudi Arabia because of what happened to Khashoggi?
No, I think the short answer to that is absolutely not. I mean,
and the long answer is no.
No, the long answer is no. The US-Saudi alliance, and it is an alliance, is too entrenched for anything like that to happen. And can I just say, it's not just, of course, the Trump administration. There is a vast Saudi presence in Washington, which is going to be pulling out all the stops to make sure that doesn't happen. There are, of course, a very strong US presence in Saudi Arabia. But, I mean, there isn't any real inclination at any level in any of the Western powers, certainly not in the United States, to see sanctions imposed on Saudi Arabia. And I think we just should dismiss that idea entirely. And I'm afraid this report about the US not providing refueling for Saudi planes, I'm afraid I consider that just a case of a bit of public relations at a time when the Khashoggi thing is
not happening yet. I mean, it's something they might do. They're considering doing.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I mean, the thing is that Riyadh and Washington simply want the Khashoggi story to go away. And you know what? It largely has, okay? Yeah. I mean, the midterms and, Pelosi and, all this stuff here. And I mean, the thing is that the Khashoggi affair, and we've talked about it here great length. I mean, he was an insider. I mean, it's not, he was a dissident on the run or anything like. Well, he didn't want to go back to Saudi Arabia, obviously, but I mean, his family relations. I mean, very powerful player in the House of Saud. But really, what they want to have happen here is that the relationship is more than the crown prince. Now, maybe the aftermath this will be is that the Americans and maybe the Europeans will follow lead, say, look, I mean, you're going to have your crown prince, okay, but we need to be able to talk to somebody. You need to send your nephew like to Geneva and to Washington and be your representative, and we will treat him as such, okay? Because what the interesting story for me about this is that those of us that have been very concerned about Yemen, we got finally. Mark, being on Crosstalk, we talked about Yemen all of the time, and then all of a sudden everybody else was too, and it was a vindication for us is that, we're not howling in the woods, okay? And so people that were actually concerned with Yemen, the Khashoggi story gave them an opening, and it did seep a bit into the mainstream media, but it won't for long, okay? It won't for long for the reasons that Alexander Mercouris enumerated.
I agree completely. This is a token effort as a political effort, this thing about not refueling Saudi planes. It's a token effort to make the Khashoggi affair go away in the eyes of the media, to say we did something, we punished Saudi Arabia in some way. Let me say, the Saudi coalition that's there, just the Gulf cooperation countries, because they've bought them from the United States, they have their own fleet of refueling tankers. By the Pentagon's own admission, they conduct only 1/5, only 20% of all refueling operations in this conflict, which means that they can continue pretty well just on their own. It's not going to change much. Also, the United Arab Emirates, which is part of this coalition and has a lot of Western-bought airplanes, flies out of Eritrea. It's close enough that it doesn't need to refuel its planes. The United States, United Kingdom, other Western countries, they still supply to Saudi Arabia hundreds of billions of dollars in arms. No one is talking about curtailing those in any way, right? They provide training to the Saudi military. They provide mercenaries for the UAE and other companies, these private mercenary companies, to conduct political assassinations of political and religious leaders. That's not stopping. The US and the UK do targeting for the Saudi coalitions. That's not stopping. In fact, as of June, the Wall Street Journal just reported that that's actually increasing. The United States also has special forces and drones on the ground. That's not stopping. The U.S. also provides C4ISR, which is command and control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, which is considered vital for any modern military operation. Not that the Saudis are doing a very good job of it, even with that, but none of that is stopping. What does that tell you? This is a token effort. The war will continue. There's actually an escalation attempt to finally siege Hodeidah right now. And, the main tool is to cut off that port from supplying food to the rest of the country, right? Even UNICEF, the UN, says the U.S., the Saudi fighters, the coalition, are targeting the majority of their targets targeted by the U.S. and UK in the room are not military targets. They're targeting food, agricultural, water supplies, food depots. They are trying to starve and cholera.
Mark, on top of this, the Trump administration is considering deeming the Houthi a terrorist organization.
Very good. Very good point. If the Trump, for by whatever insane definition of terrorism, they include the Houthis and not Saudi Arabia.
I'd like to see that one. Yeah.
That this conflict is not going anywhere. It's only going to get worse before it gets better. And Western support for Saudi Arabia has never been in question. It's all PR.
All right. Yeah.
We're getting close to 2 hours, Alex.
All right. We started with Ukraine. We'll wrap it up with Ukraine. We'll do about another 15, 20 minutes. And there's a couple questions on Ukraine. Alexander, I want you to field the first. And I would like everyone's opinion on this as well. How do you see the Orthodox schism in Ukraine? Where will that lead? And also, there's a lot of people on the chat talking about the Azov battalion being funded by the U.S. And is it a neo-Nazi battalion as well? So, Alexander, you want to kick off talking about Ukraine and what's going on there?
Well, I mean, I think the Orthodox Church. What I would simply say is, for me, what the Patriarch of Constantinople did is one of the most appalling betrayals for exactly. And as I said, I come back to something I said on an earlier live chat that we had, which is that, of course, for a Greek person, seeing the Patriarch of Constantinople, one of the major figures in our history, behaving in this fashion, meeting President Poroshenko, a man with blood on his hands, and in this way, and interfering and meddling in church affairs in that way, I find that profoundly shocking. I'm still concerned that we could see violence against Orthodox churches in Ukraine. As I have to say, at the moment, the attempts to set up an alternative Orthodox church don't seem to be going particularly well, because the various people who are involved in it or were talking about it don't seem to be able to work with each other or agree together very much. But to get a sense of what kind of an Orthodox church that would be, I've seen a picture of a mural with swastika symbols on it, in a church with swastika symbols on it, killing a double-headed eagle, which is, of course, the symbol of orthodoxy. Presumably the people thought it was a symbol of Russia. It is the symbol of orthodoxy, and that the Patriarch of Constantinople can be implicated in something like that. As a Greek, I find profoundly disturbing and very shocking. I'm hoping that it will not have the effect in Ukraine that I once thought it did, but I'm not sure. As for the Azov battalion, they are neo-Nazis. They make no secret of the fact that they are neo-Nazis. They fight with, or they parade around with neo-Nazi symbols. Their ideology is openly neo-Nazi. The fact that they are being funded by the United States, given the fact that they are openly neo-Nazi, tells you all you need to know about the policy of the United States towards Ukraine. And I think the only reason why this subject about the Azov battalion is not better known in the West is because there is a media agreement not to talk about it.
Yeah, but interestingly enough, Haaretz, I think it was Haaretz or the Jerusalem Post, they wrote very in-depth articles about how Israel is funding some of these groups here, and that's an appalling thought there too. Yeah. I mean, I don't have anything to add about the church schism that Alexander Mercouris just gave us, and on that battalion, of course.
Yes, but perhaps I will change one thing. They're not neo-Nazis; they are just Nazis.
Yes,
because I mean, as far as I can tell, these people have never moved. There's nothing neo about them.
I was going to say that myself. Yeah, Azov are not neo-Nazis; they are Banderite fascists.
Yeah,
Stefan Bandera, right? The UPA. The OUN, these were indigenous West Ukrainian fascist movements that openly supported Hitler in World War II. And after they went through a little bit of breakup, and Stefan Bandera did some time in a German comfort prison, for getting a little too big for his britches. When he was released at the end of World War II, he still went back to fight for Nazi Germany in Berlin till the end, and continued on there until he was eventually assassinated, thank God, by the Soviet Union. Yeah, they are Banderite fascists. There's no question about it. There's all this rhetoric around the world going on. Who's a fascist? Who's a fascist?
They're there.
Actual, literal, ideological fascists killing people in the name of fascism.
And we have to point out too that at the end of the Second World War, the Banderites, some of them and their descendants, got safe passage to the United States and to Canada.
And to Canada, and to South America, it must be said. And just because the primary target of their hatred right now is ethnic Russians and what they call Slovak Ukrainians, right? Left, Ukrainians that remember the Soviet Union fondly. That doesn't make them any less fascist because they're not, for the moment, majorly targeting Jews, right? Because the Nazis killed lots of people, and 30 million of them were Soviet citizens. And the U.S., as far as I know, is not directly funding Azov. When are they ever? They're always, the U.S. always tries to provide one implausible degree of separation between itself and the extremists, whether it be jihadis or neo-Nazis.
Well, I mean, but the US is right, because they are supplying arms to the Ukrainian government.
The Ukrainian government supplies arms to Azov, right? That's how it's done. There used to be a bill in U.S. law that when the U.S. was funding Ukraine under the Obama administration, providing them arms, specifically prevented them from being transferred to Azov. That was removed. That is no longer part of U.S. law. So there's nothing wrong if the Ukrainian government then transfers them arms, which they do. And it's not just Azov. It's Azov, it's C-14, it's the Right Sector, it's IDAR, it's other groups, and they're now diffused throughout the Ukrainian police and military structures. There are parallel National Guard units that operate opposite to, parallel to the police in the country, and they're open stormtroopers. Many of them are veterans of Azov and these other battalions. As for the Orthodox Church schism, the Patriarch Bartholomew, he's also suggested that he wants to, because of Moscow, the Russian Orthodox Church's response, that he wants to revoke the autocephaly of Russia, the largest Orthodox Church in the world. He's destroying what is left of the Patriarchate of Constantinople. But this is very much part of a political project to create a Ukrainian nation hostile to Russia in Eastern Europe. Centered, of course, around Western Ukraine, where that is acceptable. And what this will ultimately lead to is an excuse for the Ukrainian government to seize Russian Ukrainian Orthodox churches under the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine violently. They've already done it to some 36 churches. It will escalate, and you will see violent confrontations. And what Bartholomew doing is unforgiving, because he is deliberately facilitating and provoking violence against Orthodox churches and their clergy in Ukraine.
All right, guys. Thank you very much for all the super chats. Let me just read them off. Bobby sent us a super chat. Courtney sent us a super chat. Let's see. Steve-O sent us a super chat. There's no questions. Imre sent us a super chat. Rosebud sent us a $10 super. Great to have Mark on the panel. Thank you very much for all those super chats. Guys, let's wrap it up with this question. Do you think that Trump, is there any chance whatsoever, and let's hear all your thoughts, any chance whatsoever that Trump may change his policy towards Ukraine, or will he follow the same line that has been followed by Obama and the previous administrations? Who wants to lead?
I think he's just going to defer those decisions to John Bolton and people like John Bolton. Trump is not interested in these issues.
I have to say I agree. I don't think he's interested in Ukraine at all. I think that it's of no interest to him at all. And I don't think he's going to take on the US bureaucracy and the political people who are so committed to Ukraine in the United States by changing his policy. The policy will continue.
And Mark, what's your take?
Trump doesn't have any control over his own foreign or military policy.
That's a good point.
It hasn't been for a long time, and he doesn't know anything about Ukraine. And the neocons have completely taken over that aspect, as most aspects of U.S. foreign and military policy. I mean, I believe I read, I read it in the mainstream media, so I should check it. But that he confused the Baltics and the Balkans recently, which
he wasn't not the first one to do that.
Not the first one to do it, but it shows the extent of his knowledge of Ukraine and what's going on there. And at the end of the day, in order to keep the neocons from revolting to the Democratic side in potential impeachment hearings. He'll give them foreign policy wise to do whatever they want. And it's not going to do anything to resolve the situation in Ukraine. That's for sure.
All right, guys, we have hit 2 hours, a little over 2 hours. Thank you to everyone who tuned in for this live chat. We got one last super chat from Shay. He says, disagree, President Trump will change policy on Ukraine. Don't read the
you're right, Shay. I don't believe it, but I hope you're right.
Yeah.
There's no reason to believe he would. Okay, and I would love a counter argument.
Let's hope so. Let's hope we're all wrong. And
I'd love to be wrong. I'd love to be wrong.
Shay, we will all publicly admit we were wrong.
We will. We always
gladly.
We are not worthy. We are not worthy.
I will give you your $5 back if that happens.
All right, and thank you, Yolanta, for also sending us a super chat before we close out this live chat. Thank you, guys, for everyone who tuned in and all your questions. Peter, Alexander, Mark, do you have any closing comments in the week ahead?
Buy a T-shirt and share and tell people about our Sunday night podcast. Please, if anything, just tell a friend.
Absolutely. I second all of that. I second exactly what Peter said. And thanks for coming on our program and asking all your really interesting and good questions.
Thanks for listening to us rant. And thank you for joining the conversation yourselves. This is a lot of fun for me. I enjoy listening and watching you guys, and some of the comments are interesting, that's for sure. And some of them are really good. Some of them are interesting.
Well, tell everyone this is your first and best stop for a good geopolitical conversation, okay? You know, we take off the gloves here. And we say it as we see it, balls and strikes.
Let's chew the fat and no holds barred.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Until next week, guys. And for everyone that is a little bit confused about the time, there were some comments there. We usually are on 6:00 p.m. Moscow time. That's +3 GMT. And Moscow did not go through a time change. So yes, just keep that in mind. And Penguins fan sent us a $100 Canadian super chat. When will EU sanctions on Russia be removed? Never. Quick, let's answer that super chat.
Probably never. Not anytime soon.
How long was Jackson Vanik in effect for? Decades?
Decades. Yeah.
Probably decades. Yeah. Probably decades. And to tell you what, many Russians don't care. Our agricultural sector is now booming thanks to the sanctions. Yeah. Decoupling with the West. Thank you. Sanctions forever. We're fine. There's no huge deprivation here, and we're becoming a self-sufficient economy.
The average Russian has no idea that Russia is sanctioned by the West. Sorry.
I mean,
I believe it was during a crosstalk, Peter, before we aired, where you said once sanctions are imposed, they're very, very difficult. No matter how much even the Congress wants, it's very difficult to roll back.
In the U.S., it's very, very difficult. Yeah. Mark is right. Jackson Vanik, I mean, that was applying to Jewish immigration out of the Soviet Union, and it went on for decades afterwards, after the Soviet Union. Okay, once the sanction is made in the U.S., you have to vote to have it revoked. The Europeans have a little bit more leeway, but as long as the United States has hegemony over Europe's security policies, the sanctions will remain, irrespective of what the members of the European Union want.
Yeah. Tweety Bird says, you guys in Russia are eating well. Oh, yes, we are. And by no means am I living an oligarch lifestyle or pay, believe me. But I'm still eating very well. I think you can see the evidence of that.
You saw what I had for lunch, Mark. You saw what I had for lunch, okay? I'm a happy.
Thank you, Penguins fan, for that last minute super chat. Really appreciate it. Guys, visit the Duran shop, buy a t-shirt. It really helps out a lot. I see a lot of people commenting how they like their t-shirts. And this week, we will have a new line of t-shirts. We'll have some V-necks, some more long sleeve t-shirts for the winter that's coming ahead. So keep your eye out on that, duranshop.com. Also, donate to our PayPal and Patreon. The links are in the description down below. Thank you once again to everybody that tuned in for this super chat. Peter Lavelle, Mark Sleboda, Alexander Mercouris. I'm Alex Christoforou. Guys, thank you very, very much. And I hope everyone has a very, very safe and very good remaining Sunday. Take care.